is a great pleasure to be here and a pleasure to gotten to meet so many good students and to see so many leaders in the environmental fight from this part of the world. And, just an amazing day for me. I had so much fun. We had chapel service this morning, and that sort of old Methodist Sunday school teacher part of me got fully exercised, and it was good. And then just gazing out at this most beautiful place in the whole world, up from, and enjoying a little bit of summer ahead of time for those of us from Vermont. Could not have been nicer, and it's on beautiful, beautiful days like this, filled with good conversation. It's days like this that I'm forced to confront the fact that my main role in the world is just bumming people out, Here you are tonight, all brought together, and now to be depressed. And I apologize for that in advance, and I will do my best to get to a more hopeful place, because there's great hope, and to have met Avery and Gabby and others today is to be reminded what kind of hope there is and what possibilities there are. But look, we might as well be candid about the scale and the pace of the problem that we face, because it's only once we've figured that out, as Nick and Angelina and I were describing earlier today, only once you're sort of clear on the scale and the pace that you understand what the scale and the pace of the response needs to be. This is by far the most serious problem that human beings have yet stumbled into. We had a sense of that in 1989 when I wrote The End of Nature, which was the first book, non-technical book about this subject. We knew the basics. We knew that you burn coal, gas, oil, you put CO2 in the atmosphere, its molecular structure traps heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. We knew things would begin to warm. And plenty of people knew that it would happen. Institutions like NRDC or others that have done so much to help. But no one knew how fast it was going to happen or how hard it was going to pinch. In fact, if you had told scientists 30 years ago where we were right at the moment, they would not have believed it. They would have said, no, it'll take 50, 75, 100 years to get to where we already are in this cascading set of ecological changes. Let's just think about things we've learned in the last few weeks of this science that'll kind of remind us just what scale we're working on. We just got the new numbers for Arctic sea ice. It turns out that this winter marked the lowest maximum extent of sea ice in the north that we've ever measured. It's started melting up there now, and it's smaller than it's ever been at this season before. In fact, over the last quarter century, we've lost more than half of the summer sea ice in the Arctic. Think about that for a moment. This is millennia-old, meters-thick ice that covers an area the size of a continent. Think how much energy it takes to melt that. The energy extra energy that we trap with that carbon in the atmosphere, the carbon and methane that are warming the atmosphere, the extra energy is the heat equivalent of about 400,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs a day, okay? That's how much heat it takes to melt that kind of ice. We learned 3 or 4 days ago, courtesy of a whole new set of studies that appeared in Nature, that the already very scary melt of ice in the Antarctic is proceeding considerably faster than we had thought. And that it's likely that unless we turn things around with extraordinary rapidity, that we will see a couple of meters anyway of sea level rise in the course of this century, in the course of the lifetimes of the younger people in this room. Okay? And that's buttressed by new work that came out the week before from our greatest climatologist, Jim Hansen, looking at what's going on in Greenland and elsewhere as those ice sheets melt and melt quickly and begin to interfere with the flow of the great ocean currents of the world. What does a meter or 2 or 3 or 4 and eventually many more than that mean? I mean, you guys are much better positioned than most people in the world to understand it because you live right next to that ocean. Didn't take long of just looking around to find a story from the LA Times about your beaches here in Malibu. And this was even a year or two ago before these latest set of bad projections. But what they were describing was a Malibu without beaches anymore. I mean, forget Broad Beach becoming narrow and imagine it becoming not at all. Here's the quote from a guy named Bill Patzert, who's a good climatologist at JPL. If the latest projections of sea level rise are right, you can kiss goodbye the idea of a white sandy beach. You are going, and he's talking about Malibu in particular, he said you are going to be jumping off the seawall onto the rocks below. That's at your 25th or your 50th reunion. And that's an entirely different world. If the sea level keeps rising after that, of course, you got big problems figuring out how you're going to get here. Because the main street of this community, as Mayor Rosenthal knows all too well, is hard to defend. And of course, you guys are far better positioned to deal with this than most of the people in the world. Most of the people in the world now live in cities. Most of those cities are along coasts. Most of those cities are incredibly poor. Most of those cities have no possible way to build the kind of defenses necessary to keep out a rising ocean already in city after city, places like Miami, but also places in India and in Pakistan and in low-lying parts all over the world. We're seeing the quick rise of sea levels that's leading to constant flooding at every high tide. And we're seeing people beginning to have to evacuate the low-lying islands of this world, move away because the places where they've lived for thousands of years are no longer capable of. When we were in Paris for the big climate talks, my friend Naomi Klein and I, for reasons I'll describe later, conducted a sort of mock trial of Exxon. And we had witnesses from all over the world just describing what climate change was like. The first one sticks in my mind particularly. She was a young woman from the Marshall Islands in the Pacific, and she was describing what's happening now routinely as high tides just wash across their community. And she described the fact that their graveyard had now eroded entirely away and the bodies had floated out to sea. That their drinking water, I said, what's it like, at your house? And she said, well, this was a girl of 18 or 19, and she said the last time it happened, the wave came right into our room and it washed away the diary that I've been keeping for my entire life. And for me, that felt symbolic somehow, the kind of erasure of a young life. Think about all the other things, all the other systems that are now in rapid and dramatic flux. 2014 was the hottest year ever on this planet. Then 2015 crushed the record set in 2014. So far, 2016 is devastating the record set last year. February, you lived through real history. It was by far the hottest month we've ever measured on this planet. Everywhere. Up north, much of the Arctic taken as a whole was about 18 degrees Fahrenheit above normal for the month. That's not even really statistically possible, but it happened. And with it has already come the sort of loss of snowpack inland, the great drying out that'll lead to the onslaught of fires soon in places far north of where we've seen them before. But that same heat is at equatorial latitudes too. The ocean is hotter right now than we've ever measured it. And as we're sitting here speaking, we're in the middle of the third and by far largest of these great global coral bleaching events that we've seen over the last 15 years. There are scientists who think we may lose upwards of 10% of the world's coral reefs in this year, okay? They can't deal with that rise in temperature. I was telling people earlier at this convocation that I'd talked with the scientist who came back from aerial overflights of the Great Barrier Reef a week ago, and he described it as the saddest research trip he'd ever been on, that half the coral in the northern part of the Great Barrier Reef, the biggest coral assemblage on Earth, was dead now, turning white, bleached. Those are astonishing changes for the natural world and for the people who depend on it. 500 million people need coral reefs to provide their sustenance. That's where their food largely comes from. Indeed, we've now reached the point where these effects are having endless and painful effects on the life of people around the world everywhere. Beginning, of course, with the poorest, most vulnerable people on the world, who are also the ones who have done the least to cause any of it. Climate change is perfect inverse weapon, okay? It is the thing that that kills those who have had no part in triggering it. And so, you know, today in Pakistan, they're having unbelievable flooding in the area around Peshawar after record rains. 55, 60 people dead as of this morning. They're trying to figure out how to assemble the army to rescue people. These are the kind of rains you can only have in a world where a warmer atmosphere holds more water vapor and hence leads to more rainfall. In the Philippines, it's the opposite. The condition that you guys are too familiar with, drought, but there, because there's so little margin, drought means that people are literally starving. And a group of people, desperate people, farmers, were marching last week they just were demanding rice. They needed food. And the army, the government, of course, as often happens, overreacted and fired into this crowd of demonstrating farmers, and 10 of them were dead now. And there's still hundreds of them holed up in a Methodist church there in the Philippines. Keep them in your prayers tonight. I talked with our colleagues in the Philippines, in Fiji today, who are still dealing with the aftermath of the highest wind speeds ever measured in the southern hemisphere, Cyclone Winston that struck 5 weeks ago. The kind of wind you can only have on a superheated ocean where that supercharges the winds roaring above it. It took out, killed a bunch of people, left 60,000, which is about 10% of the population, homeless. And it did so much damage to their GDP, to their economy, that it was the financial equivalent of 10 Hurricane Katrinas striking simultaneously. Okay? This happens now around the world, someplace every day. Some fast or slow manifestation of this new crisis. Think about our hemisphere, the things that we've witnessed just in the last few months. The sudden, rapid spread of a hitherto barely heard of disease, the Zika virus, spread literally on the wings of Aedes aegypti, this mosquito whose range has expanded dramatically as the temperature warmed and moisture levels went up. There are now 4 countries in South America that are telling women not to become pregnant, okay, not to have children, for at least the next couple of years until people can figure out some way to treat the massive birth defects that come with, I mean, think about that. That's like a science fiction story where you tell people that they can't have children anymore, okay? But it's very, very real. And here's the hard part. We are still at the early stage of climate warming. We've raised the temperature of the planet, taken as a whole, a little more than 1 degree Celsius, closing in on 2 degrees Fahrenheit. But on our current path, our current trajectory, we're going to raise it 3.5 or 4 degrees Celsius by the time the century is out, 7, 8 degrees, unless we change course very quickly. And if we do that, then civilization will not work. There's no way to do the things that we need to do to have civilizations. You can't grow enough food. A team at Stanford and the University of Washington issued a big study not long ago demonstrating that from this point on, each degree increase in global average temperature should cut grain yields about 10%. Okay? So if you increase the temperature 2, 3, 4 degrees and you cut the number of calories on Earth by 20 or 30%, you all know enough about the world to know what that means for development, for war and peace, for women's rights, for public health, for all the things that we care about but that we cannot have on a destabilizing planet. Already it's coming very apart at the seams. We've seen the pictures of refugees streaming up into Europe from Syria and elsewhere in the Middle East. And we've seen the stress that that's put on political systems in Europe and the rise of a kind of hard right nativist reaction with all the possibilities that we know that leads to. Well, those people coming out of Syria are in no small measure climate refugees. Yeah, there's a lot of things that were going wrong in that part of the world, but the thing that as a series of academic papers have now made pretty clear was the kind of clearest trigger was the fact that for the last 7 or 8 years, what we used to call the Fertile Crescent went through by far the deepest drought it's ever seen. And what that meant was that 1 million or more farmers were driven off the farm and into the cities in Syria, and then weak and despotic government was unable to cope with that kind of influx, and the chaos we see results. They are the harbinger of what will be many, many more in the course of this century, unless we get to work. This is the biggest thing humans have ever done, and we have to stop it. We have to stop it. And the good news, and there is a little bit of good news anyway, the good news is we know now most of what we need to know in order to stop it, you know. When we talked about this 10 and 20 years ago, there was a kind of despairing note because the technologies that would replace coal and gas and oil weren't entirely clear. We talked about things like solar panels with our fingers crossed because they weren't quite ready for prime time, you know. Solar panels were still sort of what aging hippies down in their basement, you know, with the lead acid batteries pottering around. And God bless them, because people like that figured out the kind of next steps in this technology. And now, it's not only ready for prime time in the places where we've put it to work, it's doing what needs to be done. It's the most astonishing technological transition we've ever witnessed the beginning of. Not very many places have tried hard, but those that have had spectacular results. I told people earlier this morning that Denmark last year generated 49% of its power from the wind, okay? Which either means that Denmark has conspired to steal all the wind from the rest of the world, or it means they possessed the political will to put technology to work. The Germans are the great example. Look, Germany caused more than its fair share of problems in the last century. In this one, they're providing more than their fair share of the solutions. It was Germany that really decided to pay the price to drive the renewable revolution. And they did everything they could think of. As of last year, there were still more solar panels in Bavaria than there were in the United States, okay? We've now passed Bavaria, but we haven't caught up to Germany yet. That means that this past summer, there were days when the Germans generated 75% of their electricity from the sun. In Germany, okay? Not in Malibu, not in Arizona, not in Florida, not in Texas. Nobody's ever gone to Germany for a kind of beach vacation, you know? And yet there they are, proving that it is not the resource that matters is political will. the kind of political will that we need to build and that we can build, and that there are people hard at work here trying to build. We can even see exciting change in poor parts of the world. China's become the biggest installer of renewable energy on the planet, breakneck pace. Very poor countries like Bangladesh are quickly rolling out renewable energy. By the 2020 or 2021, we think every village in Bangladesh will be solarized. That a nation that the fossil fuel era for 200 years did nothing for will have a solar panel in pretty much every hut that there is, and people with access at least to the beginnings of the electric age. And we see it here in California in exciting ways. Look, it was pretty damn interesting this week when Elon Musk said, here's my new car. It's not quite ready yet, but you can pay me $1,000 if you'd like. And 280,000 people or something lined up to do it. The guy's got now billions of dollars worth of capital to go actually deliver the darn things. And when he does, it's easy to imagine that it won't be long in this state before, well, hopefully before, traffic at least will be quiet and non-polluting. The Norwegians announced last week that there will be no non-electric cars sold in Norway beginning, the last ones will be sold 6 years from now. And after that, if you want to buy a car, you got to buy an electric one. Already, electric cars make up more than half of new car sales in Norway. That's where the future is headed. So the question is, and on the answer to this question lies whether or not you're going to be optimistic or despairing. The question is how fast we can get to that future. Can we somehow get there in time to catch up with to catch up with physics, to catch up with the climatic devastation that's already underway? We're not going to stop global warming, okay? It's too late for that. We're going to live with some of it. The question is, can we keep it from getting utterly out of control? And the answer is entirely unclear, okay? It depends absolutely on how quickly we're able to make this change happen. And that is the frustrating thing, okay? Because the change is not happening anywhere near as fast as it could be. And the reason that it's not happening anywhere near as fast as it could be is because there are people who are trying to keep it from happening. And those people work for the fossil fuel industry, which is the richest industry the world has ever seen, and who would like to keep that status a few years longer, even at the cost, as it is now completely clear, of breaking the one Earth that we've got. That may sound hyperbolic to you, but I'm afraid is not. And we've learned that beyond any shadow of a doubt in the last year. Great journalists at Inside Climate News, at the LA Times, elsewhere, published a series of remarkable investigations about the biggest fossil fuel company on Earth, Exxon. And what they uncovered, and these are now allegations strong enough that the attorney generals of California and New York have launched criminal investigations. What they uncovered was the fact that Exxon knew everything there was to know about climate change back as long ago as the 1970s. There makes sense too, because these were companies whose business was carbon, so it makes sense that they would have scientists tasked to understand what carbon meant. And what they found as early as the 1970s was pretty much exactly what's happened. They were telling senior executives how much the temperature was going to go up. And those senior executives were paying attention because, what do you know, Exxon started laying out plans to bid for new parcels to drill on in the Arctic because they were clear it was going to melt. They started building all their drilling rigs to account for the fact that sea level was going to rise, all right? They did all that, but they didn't tell any of the rest of us anything. In fact, just the opposite. They spent tens of millions of dollars building the architecture of deceit and denial that waged a kind of phony debate for a quarter century that may turn out to have been the crucial quarter century. It may turn out to have been the quarter century that will be measured out in geologic time. They and their friends were the ones who hired the scientists who used to work for the tobacco industry to carry forward the same lines of argument that they'd used there, that there was doubt and uncertainty and so on. And the results now are measured in the pH of the oceans, in the steady rise of the seas, and this continues to this day as this industry continues to fund politicians to make sure that change never happens. The Koch brothers will spend $900 million on this election, they've said. Taken together, the two of them are the richest man on earth, and they made their money in oil and gas, and they spend their money to make sure that nothing ever challenges that primacy. Okay? It took me a long time to figure out what was going on. There are people who are much savvier in the world than me. I'm looking at my friend R.L. Miller over there, who's one of the great political activists on this question in California. Or Kelly, who's been working on this forever, or all kinds of people, okay? I spent too many years, because I'm a writer, thinking that we were engaged in an argument, and that therefore I should write more books. And because that's how academics and writers think. The answer to all problems is more data, argument, metaphor, whatever, and eventually the other side will say, oh, you were right, let's do what we should do. It turned out that that's not what we were engaged in. We were not having an argument. We were having a fight. We'd won the argument. The scientific community by the mid-1990s was entirely clear on what was going on. We were having a fight, and the fight was about money and power. And once that finally got through my head, I understood that it was time to try and do something else. To try and, since we were never going to match the money of this industry, to instead find alternate currencies to work in. The currencies of movements, of passion, spirit, creativity, the willingness sometimes to spend one's body and go to jail. And so that's what we started trying to do. There was really no climate movement in this country. We had this superstructure of a climate movement. We had Al Gore, and we had scientists, and we had policy people, but the part that we'd forgotten was the movement part, the part that would give it any heft, that might worry or impress public officials and get things going. And you could tell that we had no movement, because when we went to Copenhagen 6 or 7 years ago for these big world talks on climate change, nothing happened. Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton came home completely empty-handed, and they paid not the slightest price for it. There was nobody to hold them accountable, and there have to be people to hold things accountable. So we tried. We started 350.org. I was telling students earlier, in order to try and remind them the power they have. We started 350.org with myself and 7 undergraduates at the college in Vermont where I hang out, Middlebury College, a lot like this one. Scenic in a different way. No ocean, but beautiful forest and mountains. As I told them this morning, there were 7 students who were interested in this project. There are 7 continents. Each one of the students took one. And we went to work. And our job was to find people like ourselves. The guy who took the Antarctic did the internet also, okay? Our job was to find people like ourselves everywhere around the world. The people who were worried, and maybe not about climate change so far, but about public health, about hunger, about war and peace, about development. And all of you who've been around the world know that there are people like that in every place, and they understand. The closer they are to the ground, the more they understand that you can't have those things as the world deteriorates around. So they were our natural allies, and we said, our first task was just to try and drive this most important of numbers, 350 parts per million CO2, to drive it into the information bloodstream of the planet. So we said to everybody, let's have a day where we just take this and do what we can, okay? And we picked almost a day almost at random and told everybody around the world to do something. And we got the first sense, we had no money and no organization or anything. We're all volunteers. And we got the first sense it might work 2 days early. We told everybody to do this on a Saturday, but that Thursday, we were sitting around our one-room office, around our one table with our laptops open, doing our work, putting out press releases, whatever. And the phone rings, and it's our leader in Ethiopia, who, like most of our leaders, everybody was a volunteer, like most of them was a she, and like a surprising number was 17 years old, okay? And she was in tears. She said, the government took away our permit for the weekend, so we're doing this today before they can stop us. Now that was brave, because it's not a very nice government necessarily, but that wasn't why she was crying. She kept saying, we wanted to do this the same time as everybody else. We wanted to be part of the whole big thing. We don't want to spoil it for people. We're so sorry, and we have 15,000 kids marching right now in Addis Ababa, you know. So I was like, Luau, don't worry about the date, it's okay, you know. And it was okay. For the next 72 hours or so, these pictures were flowing in. I'll just show you the tiniest fraction of them at the rate of about 20, 30 a minute, because there were 5,200 demonstrations in 181 countries. CNN said it was the most widespread day of political activity in the planet's history. Second picture actually came from US troops in Afghanistan. Made a 350 with sandbags. They said, we're parking our Humvee for the weekend and walking, okay? But most of the images were coming from, I mean, what struck me first and foremost, hardest really, watching these images, was that I had always heard that environmentalism was something that rich white people did, okay? And that if you didn't know where your next meal was coming from, you wouldn't be an environmentalist and blah, blah, blah. It just turned out that that was wrong. Almost all the people we were working with around the world who wanted to do this were poor and black and brown and Asian and young, because that's what most of the world consists of, you know? And if you're in those communities, the future bears down on you very hard. I mean, look, that's someplace on the Congo River above Kinshasa. It's, you know, where Joseph Conrad, in his Eurocentric way, identified the heart of darkness on our planet, but there they were. Poor. They didn't have a digital camera, so their home darkroom didn't, they had to write in what their banner had said, but somehow the t-shirt had permeated there, you know, into the middle of the world, and they were engaged, and all over the world. Great creativity, great wit. Take that one to heart, you guys. For the first time, and this was now 6 years ago, we had the big involvement of religious communities. Religious communities had not historically done a good job of dealing with environmental questions. For liberal churches, the environment had been seen as a kind of item you got to after hunger and poverty, you know, and for conservative churches, it was like, this is a way station on the road to paganism, okay? But finally, people were beginning to kick in. So like, there's a big multi-faith march in Cape Town. There's the head of Muslim South Africa. This guy is sort of in charge of indigenous traditions. That's the Anglican Archbishop, Desmond Tutu's successor, at the head of a huge march. There are your friends at Wheaton, you know. I'd done some organizing in the Middle East, in the Holy Land. I went to Bethlehem to do a little organizing because the Dead Sea is dropping extremely rapidly as temperatures rise. Well, everybody there wanted to help, but as you know, it's a difficult place, and there were too many military checkpoints and stuff in the way to do one thing. So the Jordanians said, we'll make the big 3 on our beach. The Palestinians said, we'll do the 5 in Palestine. The Israelis said, we'll make the 0 where we are. It was for obvious reasons, people liked it and got covered. We did 200 or 300 demonstrations in China, which is a really important part of this equation. The Chinese are doing amazing things. Those are our brothers and sisters in the Maldives Islands, okay? Incredibly, I mean, if you wanted to see, even if there was any place on earth that looked much more like paradise than Malibu, it would be the Maldives, okay? There's 1,000 islands spread out in this archipelago about 1,200 miles across the equator in the Indian Ocean. It's a nation that's been there and inhabited for 5,000 years, okay? It couldn't be more beautiful. White sand beaches, coconut palms, reef everywhere. Well, the fly in the ointment is that the highest place in the nation is 2-3 meters above sea level. That's not a good place to be in a rapidly warming world. They may lose they probably will in the course of this century, but they're fighting hard. That's the Student Government Association holding their meeting in the lagoon to demonstrate their problem. And Gabby, you were asking earlier about what to do. Well, that might be something to do down in your lagoon someday to kind of demonstrate the problem that people are up against here. For 36 hours or so, this was the big story, the lead story on Google News. More things leaking, and I think one of the reasons that happened was because people didn't look the way that we think environmentalists are supposed to look like. So there's Yemen, which is the toughest place on the planet, perhaps, right now. All the women in that zero are wearing full black burqa. So to us, they do not look like the local chapter of the Sierra Club, okay? But their hearts are in exactly the same place. They're not thinking about themselves. They're thinking about the future, about their kids, about the rest of creation. They're doing what we should be doing. The same in so many places. There were 300 or 400 pictures that ended up in a file just marked 350 adorable. And they were very adorable, and they were also hard to look at. Those girls will be refugees in their lifetime, and not from anything they did, from stuff we did, okay? So we've kept doing this. We've done now, we think, 20,000 demonstrations in every country except North Korea, and they're beautiful. It's the work that I've loved, and everybody's loved getting to do it because it's been very effective education in places all over the planet, including really hard places, okay? And places that I'd never heard of, and places that I'd heard of but for other reasons, and just, you name it. And so exciting to get to use art in huge ways, There's Tom York, the lead singer of Radiohead, organized 3,000 of his closest friends to make that, gave them all blue raincoats so they could make that image of King Canute trying to hold back the rising seas on Brighton Beach. And we did this day of art projects. They called it the biggest art projects in the planet's history. They were so big we had to borrow satellite time in order to take the pictures, to back up far enough to see them. My favorite was that from Santa Fe, one of those now dry arroyo riverbeds in the desert. But when the satellite came over, 2,000 or 3,000 people just whipped blue blankets overhead for a second to kind of bring the river back to life. So had we all the time in the world, this is just what we would keep doing in order to win this fight, this sort of gradual education of people about the fix that we're in. Gradual change is the best kind of change. It's how humans and their societies change best, easiest, cheapest, everything else. We don't have the time. We don't have 35 years, 50 years. We had to start 25 years ago if we had any hope of getting ahead of this. We are way behind the curve now. So we joined fairly quickly, not just education, but confrontation, and tried to build this movement again in a way that hadn't been built since groups like NRDC had launched the environmental movement at the first Earth Day, We wanted to go back into the streets, and it was sort of the beginning of that. Some of you have heard about this fight over the Keystone Pipeline. When it began in the summer of 2011, there was no chance that we could win, none at all. The National Journal, our insider newspaper in DC, had polled its 300 energy experts, and 93% of them said that TransCanada Company would have its permit by the end of 2011 to build the pipeline. Big Oil had never lost a fight like that at all. But we figured we had to try. Jim Hansen, our greatest climatologist, had just written a paper saying that the tar sands in Alberta, where that pipeline begins. If they were fully exploited, there's so much carbon up there that you'd raise the atmospheric concentration of CO2 from its present 400 to about 540 parts per million just from Alberta, okay? So we had to try and stop it, and I wrote a letter asking people to come to DC and get arrested, and what do you know? People did. It turned into the biggest civil disobedience action in 30 years in this country about anything, and then 1,200 and some people went to jail, and then it spread around the world, and then back to the U.S. And we circled the White House with people that November of 2011, and 5 deep, tens of thousands of people on hand, the biggest demonstrations at the White House in the Obama years. And what do you know? President Obama said, maybe we should take another look at this. In fact, we'll postpone consideration till after the election in 2012. Okay, which is good. That's what we wanted. And then we kept it up. People sent more emails to the Senate than about any issue in a single day, and more public comments than any infrastructure project in history. A lot of this work led by indigenous groups on both sides of the border, because it's their land up in Canada that's being wrecked. A lot of it led by climate justice groups in the communities, mostly Black and Hispanic communities where the refineries were located, where they were going to send this toxic stuff, on and on and on. Finally, last fall, the president said, okay, we won't build it. That was good news, because it's 800,000 barrels a day of the dirtiest oil on earth that'll stay underground. But more, it was good news because in the process, it had really helped kick off what's now a kind of global resistance to every fossil fuel infrastructure project. The head of the American Natural Gas Association, speaking at a conference to his industry peers last year, said something that I confess warmed the sinister cockles of my heart. He said, we simply have to find a way to stop the Keystoneization of every project on the planet. That made me very happy to hear. Because people are fighting, and now they're starting to win over and over and over again. We've beaten plans for what would have been the biggest coal mine in the world in Australia, I think. The other pipelines that were supposed to come out of the tar sands, First Nations, Aboriginal people in Canada, stopped them cold. Our colleagues in New York State have managed to put a moratorium on fracking, which no one thought was possible, and that's now spread many other places. If you're lucky, you'll be able someday to persuade even Governor Brown that it might be all right not to frack in California, going forward. In fact, there's going to be a real opportunity to talk about these things. Next month, we're doing this global day of action called Break Free 2016, and all the big carbon deposits around the world, people will be in action, including in the city of Los Angeles, where, of course, in poor neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color, there are oil wells pumping day and night, 10 feet from where people live, 20 feet from where people go to school, okay? I mean, this is not something that would ever happen in Malibu because there's enough political power to make sure it wouldn't happen. But there's not enough political power in those communities, and so it's a place where people will be converging that day. If you want to help, I think the website is la.breakfree2016.org, and you'll be joining with people in all parts of the world. I could show pictures all day. These are from a day of action we did around the planet that just was for people who had already felt the sting of climate change, were kind of rallying in place. 3,500 locations around the planet. I mean, that's up in Siberia. We're now seeing big forest fires 3, 4, 5 degrees latitude north where we've ever seen them before because it's so hot and so dry up in those places. Those are people who are leaving their homes in Micronesia because the seas have risen too high. Top red balloon is where the level of the Dead Sea was 40 years ago. These are the people in the zone in Pakistan who in 2010 saw the biggest flooding since Noah. It rained so hard up in the Khyber Pass that by the time it was done, the Indus River had swelled to the point that it covered 25% of Pakistan. 20 million people were out of their homes. Okay? Imagine 2/3 of California out of their homes. Okay? And you can tell by looking at them, probably not people who did much to cause the fix that we are currently in. Everywhere Everywhere the same thing happening. And what's been beautiful is, well, that picture sticks in my mind, not because it was a big demonstration, it obviously wasn't, just some muddy street turned into a river in Haiti, but the signs that those kids, your actions affect me, which is true. More people died in Haiti from Hurricane Sandy than in New York, okay? Your actions affect me, but not vice versa. There's nothing anyone in Haiti can do that can materially affect the outcome here. They can't get to the White House to demonstrate. They can't burn less fossil fuel. They don't burn any now. And they don't have portfolios and endowments and things that they could divest from fossil fuel. That's what we've been working on across much of the world too the last few years. Not just playing defense against new projects, but playing offense against this industry. We started with the analysis that financial analysts in the UK were providing. They went through all the annual reports and SEC filings and things of the fossil fuel companies, and what they found was that these guys had in their declared reserves 5 times as much carbon as any scientist thinks we can safely burn. 5 times what would take us past the even unsafe 2-degree mark. And yet they've announced they're going to burn it. That's what their business plan is. That's what they've told their banks, their stockholders, everybody else. If they carry out their business plan, then the planet tanks, period, end of story. No drama, no mystery, okay? That makes them rogue companies. They are not normal companies anymore if they're willing to do that, and if they're willing to put the lobbying and political power in to make sure that they're allowed to do it, okay? Which is why we launched this 3 years ago, this divestment campaign, which students here have been doing a very good job of pushing here, like all over the world. And it's been more successful. We kind of modeled it on the one that was about apartheid in South Africa 25 years ago, which some of you of a certain age like mine may recall. And we did it because, in part because Desmond Tutu of South Africa, who'd been such a leader then, asked us to do it again in regard to fossil fuel. And it's been successful beyond anyone's wildest imaginings. As of December, endowments and portfolios worth $3.4 trillion had divested from fossil fuel. Entire denominations, the United Church of Christ, the Episcopalians, the Unitarians, the World Council of Churches, huge universities have begun, Stanford, Oxford, Edinburgh, Sydney, places that we had no idea would ever divest. Maybe the most dramatic thing was what happened a year ago when the Rockefeller family and their charitable foundations, because remember, this is the first family of fossil fuel. John D. Rockefeller was the first oil fortune. They said they thought it was no longer financially prudent or morally possible to hold investments in fossil fuels, and sold them off. So it's worth just thinking as you think about yourselves as an institution. If the Rockefeller family has found it immoral to be invested in fossil fuel, it's a good question to ask whether or not it's okay for a place like Pepperdine to do so or not. And these are important, interesting questions going forward. The thing that's been really great, along with that money divested and the kind of social license that it's taken away from the fossil fuel industry, is that the work that students here and in 1,000 other places have done all over the world has taken that basic message about carbon and driven it into the middle of the conventional wisdom. Now it's no longer, I wrote the first article about this whole carbon bubble stuff, okay, and it was in Rolling Stone, and it wasn't even on the cover. Justin Bieber was on the cover, okay? But now it's not in Rolling Stone. Now it's the head of the IMF or the head of the World Bank or the governor of the Bank of England speaking to the world's insurance industry at Lloyd's of London in November, using the same math, using the same phrases, understanding that we face this huge stranded asset problem. So there are fights going forward on so many fronts. Every place we're doing our best to stand up and fight. You saw those amazing images last summer when further up the coast in Portland and Seattle, kayaktivists, as they called them, by the thousands managed to block the huge drilling rigs that Shell wanted to send to the Arctic. And Shell has now said they're not going to try and drill in the Arctic anymore. This was the big climate march in New York City in the fall of 2014. 400,000 people streaming through the middle of New York, the biggest demonstration about anything in this country in a very long time. Okay? Those are the reasons why things went a little better in Paris than they did in Copenhagen. Because there's now, thanks to you, some kind of movement to try and hold people accountable. And maybe since we're on the ocean, let me just finish by showing you a few pictures of your brothers and sisters from the other end of the sea. In the South Pacific Islands, which, as I said before, face a kind of existential threat. They may not be there by the end of the century. But the slogan they've taken, as you can see, is "We are not drowning, we are fighting." And the same day that we were all marching in New York, they did something equally interesting in Newcastle in Australia. On each of the 10 islands there, Vanuatu, the Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, Fiji, they felled a tree and built an indigenous canoe. So they had a fleet of 10 canoes like that one. And they took them to the largest coal port on Earth, which is in Newcastle in Australia. And for a day, they used them to blockade the largest ore ships in the world, to keep them in the harbor for a day. And it was an action of great beauty and power. And it symbolizes the fight that's underway of the small and many against the few and big and rich. The epic battle that there's ever been on this planet. The thing that, it's not Avatar, it's real, okay? And the stakes are unbelievably high, and we don't know how it's going to come out. Okay? If I was a good organizer, I'd tell you we're going to rally and win and rah, 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 and let's do it. But I'm a writer, so I got to tell you the truth, which is we don't know. We've waited a very long time to get started. The physics, as I've explained before, is daunting. The temperature is rising faster than we thought it would. Things are dark. On the other hand, the movement is building faster than we thought it could. And that's very good news. And what it means is that we need all of you engaged in whatever ways that you can. And we need you actually engaged in ways that go outside your comfort zone, all right? I'm not going to tell you exactly what they all are, but you will figure them out. And I will, well, since we were talking earlier about it today, for some reason I had on my mind a little bit that those protests in Washington, that civil disobedience that started the Keystone fight, which was a good moment, an important moment. I'm looking around. One of the things I like about this audience is its demographic, its age diversity, okay? I wrote the letter asking people to come get arrested in DC. And one of the things I said in it was, I don't think college kids should have to be the cannon fodder in this case, okay? As you've seen from those pictures, young people pretty much leading this fight everywhere. But if you're 22 in our economy right now, it's possible that an arrest record is not the best thing on earth for your resume, okay? One of the few unmixed blessings of growing older is, past a certain point, what the hell are they going to do to you, you know? And so it was with some pleasure that we watched people with hairlines like mine descending on DC. We did not say, because it would be rude, how old are you? But we did say, cleverly I think, who was president when you were born? And the two biggest cohorts were from the FDR and the Truman administrations. And on the last day, there was a guy arrested with a sign around his neck that said, World War II vet, handle with care. He was so old, he'd been born in the Warren Harding administration, which was long enough ago, I'd forgotten there was a Warren Harding administration, okay? What was good about it was that the young people who were there, and there were plenty, got to see their elders acting the way that elders need to act in a working civilization, okay? It was beautiful. And since we're in a campus setting, I'll repeat something I said at dinner time. If there happen to be any of you here who have tenure, all this goes triple for you. Your invulnerability is a reason to take action, okay? The other thing we said when we asked people to come get arrested was, would you mind wearing a necktie or a dress if you're coming to do this? Now, not because, I live in Vermont, which is even less formal than Malibu, okay? I can go years at a time without wearing a necktie. I can hardly speak with the one on that I have now, okay? But we wanted to send a message that undergirds the message I've been trying to get across all night, which is there is absolutely nothing radical in anything that I'm talking about at all that we're asking for. When the students ask for divestment, nothing radical at all about that. Just the opposite. All we are asking for is a world that works a little bit like the Holocene, like the 10,000 years of benign climatic stability that underwrote the rise of human civilization. The only period of time that we have any written information about humans at all, We're out of the Holocene now. We've left it in the lifetimes of pretty much everybody in this room. We don't know what we're going into, but to say we want a world that at least resembles the one that humans have always known, that's not radical, that's conservative. Deeply conservative. Radicals work at oil companies. If you are willing to get up in the morning and make your fortune by altering the chemical composition of the atmosphere that God gave us, if you are willing to do that past the point that scientists have told you what will happen, if you're willing to do it past the point where you've seen those predictions coming true, then you are a dangerous radical of a kind we have not encountered before. And our job is to check that radicalism, to do it as fast as we can and hope that it's fast enough. I can't tell you if it's going to be fast enough. We don't know. I can tell you, and this is good and important news, and you can verify it because you've seen it with your eyes now. All over the world, you have brothers and sisters engaged in this fight. All over the world tonight, there are people in halls like this one figuring out what to do next, who to elect, who to lobby, where to push, how to go to jail, how to build new renewable resources in their place, all the things that have to happen if we're going to get anywhere. It's always a great honor for me to be in those rooms with those people, many of them in places that did not cause this problem. And it's a great honor to be in this room with you all and just get to say I look forward very much to fighting shoulder to shoulder with you going forward. Thank you all very much.